And so without further ado then, I'm going to hand over to Rubana Huq, who is serving as chair for the meeting. So Rubana, over to you.
Thank you, Jamie. Welcome to the webinar, everyone. We are discussing and celebrating Daniel Vaughan Whitehead's book, Behind the Rise of the Global Supply Chains. So congratulations, Daniel. I've had the pleasure of reading the book, and as a manufacturer and an exporter from Bangladesh, it was easy for me to relate to the content. Very often trapped in low value-added segments, accompanied by little attention to purchasing practices, and with, of course, lead time pressures and increased production costs, almost in all cases of wages, working conditions are all impacted. And at the same time, lack of R&D and almost too easy an approach to product development from the suppliers also don't improve much, and that also contributes to what we have today. And when approached with the critical questions on decent work deficits, suppliers also have little to say. So it's a delicate balance, and the lack of bridge connecting the corporate to the core of human capital, which is labor, it makes us ponder on our own inadequacy. And this can only be resolved if we are all in it together. So today we are looking forward to a lively discussion. Daniel will be presenting his book, followed by discussions by Professor Damian Grimshaw, who's the Professor of Employment Studies and Associate Dean for Research Impact at King's College London, and who was also with ILO for 2 years. And after Professor Grimshaw, we will also have the opportunity to listen to Julie Vallat, who has been with L'Oréal since June 2019, and she's the VP of Human Rights. And after Ms. Vallat, we'll also be hearing from Ms. Véronique Rochet. She's the Senior Head of Sustainability at Puma Group. So Daniel, without further ado, I'd like to turn to you for your book presentation. And congratulations once again.
Thanks a lot, Rubana, for this nice introductory remarks. And yeah, welcome to all of you in this webinar. It's really a pleasure for me, to present this book. And maybe, as an introduction, I would like, to present you 2 slides, to explain you the title of the book before, having a deep dive into the contents and results. So clearly, as you see in this, in these slides, no doubt global supply chains are a success story so far. And we document this, in chapter 1 of the book. And clearly, global supply chains became the dominant business model, since 90% of trade now is passing through global supply chains. They generated millions of jobs and also clearly contributed to developing countries' rapid growth. So they contributed, to a sort of economic catching up. At the same time, it allows major brands to operate on a large scale at reduced cost, because with this global, supply chain business model, they don't have to, to own the factories. They don't have to employ millions of workers. They just have to rely on their suppliers. And brands have never been so successful, with record profits over the last decade. So clearly, a success story. At the same time, there are some issues behind the rise. And, brands do not always know their supply chains and the myriad of supplies and sub-supplies, producing, for them. This means that there are sort of external, environmental externalities, and also often very poor wages and work conditions, along the supply chains. And those vulnerabilities were quite clear, during the 2008 economic crisis, and even further exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, clearly there are weaknesses, within this business model. And we also, there are quite a lot of studies showing that there is a sort of unequal redistribution of profits within supply chains. And supplies sourcing countries can often remain trapped in low value added segments. So it's really this hidden parts, of global supply chains that I wanted to further investigate, with this book. How did I do it? Well, clearly with significant fieldwork. And in fact, this is, 4 years of fieldwork before the COVID-19 crisis with 3 main exercises. First, a global supplier survey, interviewing, nearly 1,500 suppliers in 87 countries, 23 sectors. Then among those 1,500 suppliers, take 31 suppliers on which I carried out detailed qualitative case studies. So in 3 continents, 5 countries, we covered, Bangladesh, China, India, Turkey, and South Africa. And those qualitative case studies were quite good because they allowed me to have data from both the worker side to know better about wages, working conditions, health and safety conditions, and also data from the managers of suppliers, that documented the purchasing practices side. And at the same time, a survey among buyers, among 102 buyers, to close the circle. So this really allowed us, in a way, to capture what is the relationship between the buyers and suppliers. And clearly, I define 5 major purchasing practices. First, the type of contract, between the buyer and suppliers. And you can see here, very, quickly, a couple of graphs. I will try to summarize in a few minutes, but you can see already here, 35% of suppliers have some non-written contracts with the buyers. And even if they have a contract, only 44% of those contracts specify who would be responsible for the costs when there are changes in orders. And clearly, when there are changes in orders, it's often the actor with the lowest bargaining position which loses, and generally suppliers. At the same time, accuracy of technical specifications are also rather poor. This is the second major. And we see here that 33% of suppliers suggest that technical specifications are not accurate enough. Third, lead times, buyers' placement of orders. And here you can see in this, third graph, the majority of suppliers reported that more than 30 to 50% of their orders had insufficient lead times. Fourth, and you have this fourth graph as well, the support to implement codes of conduct is sometimes very weak, from the buyers or the lead firms. 90% of the suppliers reported that the buyers are expecting them to follow a code of conduct. This is positive, right? Code of conduct on social standards. But at the same time, half of suppliers, 49%, reported also not to receive any help to achieve such social standards. And when they receive some support from the buyers, it's very rarely about financial assistance, for implementing those social standards. So clearly, again, the burden is often on the suppliers and not on the lead firms or the buyers. And fifth and most sensitive area, in fact, pricing. And you can see here 2 significant results. From the surveys, we asked, managers of suppliers whether they had to accept over the last year orders with prices below their production cost. And you can see here 39% of suppliers reported, exactly to be in this situation, to have to accept orders whose prices are below their production cost. 39%. And this percentage is even higher in certain sectors like textile and clothing, 52%, and also higher in developing countries, with low human development index, 54%. It's a bit lower in countries with more diversity. That enjoy more diversity in the number of buyers they're working with. So these typically suppliers in more developed countries, there, I mean, 34% were in a position also, to accept prices from the buyers below their production costs. So this is one significant result, because you can imagine the implications then on wages and working conditions at the end of the supply chain. And second results about prices, we ask, suppliers whether the buyers, well, how were the buyers behaving when there was an increase in the legal minimum wage in the sourcing country? And only 1/4 of buyers were found to be willing to reflect this minimum wage increase into the prices proposed to suppliers, 1/4. And even so, for those who accept to integrate that minimum wage increase in the prices, they do that on average after 12 weeks. So that means that for 3 months, clearly the burden is again on suppliers' shoulders. So this to tell you that there is clearly an issue here in terms of pricing, and this has implication on working conditions. And this, in fact, is the second part of the book, where I'm really trying to investigate what are the effects on working conditions of these different purchasing practices. And I did that again from suppliers, managers' answers. I succeeded to have econometric analysis from both the managers and workers' data, from the qualitative case studies. And also the survey among buyers was also providing an additional element of evidence. And not really surprisingly, all sources of information converge to identify the same type of effects on wages and working conditions. And I would like to show you 3 main types of effects, just to illustrate. Of course, you will find many more examples, also interviews with workers, with managers in the book. But here, just to illustrate, I would like to show you first the effects of inaccurate technical specifications. And I was quite surprised when I saw this effects of inaccurate technical specifications, because I was not really expecting that kind of amplified effects. From the suppliers survey, we could see that those inaccurate technical specifications lead on average to a decrease of wages among suppliers by 16%. So this is quite a lot. And this is, because the suppliers have to reproduce samples one after the other. The technical specifications are not precise enough from the buyers. And this leads to, delays in the production process. And of course, there is a lot of stress in the production process. And at the end, there are shortcuts that the managers has to take, and there are more difficulties to pay wages, and also wages are much lower. And you can see that here, it's interesting to see that the buyers are aware of this issue, because they report that indeed inaccurate technical specifications are leading, to higher use of overtime hours, and also to more heavy working rhythms and intensity at work, and also a more systematic recourse to temporary workers from the suppliers. So this is one example of inaccurate technical specifications. The second example is about lead times, and we know that where you have lead times, this is leading to a sort of delays in the production process. There is a cost involved, and the suppliers to keep their margin also have to take a certain number of decisions. Interestingly enough, when there is shorter lead times, wages are not lower but higher, because you have higher number of working hours. But this is increasing total wages to the detriment, of course, of higher number of overtime hours for the workers. And at the same time, from the supplier survey, we could see that the suppliers are in fact reacting to very short lead times in three ways. They increase overtime hours. This is the first way. Second, they increase their temporary labor force. And third, they will start hiring subcontracted workers. And these were three direct effects that we could see. So it's not that, you know, it's one or the other. Generally, they have a recourse to those, you know, three types of adjustments, you know, to very short lead times. And then one thing that was quite fascinating to test was the effect of prices below costs. And here, on average, through the economic, you know, analysis that you know, I carried out, we could see that wages were declining by 11%. You had an increase in the temporary labor force, and also, and this is quite a strong result, an increase in subcontracting by 17%. And it's quite interesting to see that the buyers are aware of this issue. When we ask them, you know, what could be the correlation between prices below costs and working conditions, you know, 85% of them responded that, yes, it might have an effect on wages because clearly the margins of the suppliers is reduced. So this is really a couple of examples of the effects that we identified on working conditions. You know, this is the first type of evidence. Of course, it must be, you know, followed by other studies, but it's the first type of evidence that, in a way, isolates this relationship between purchasing practices on the one hand and wages and working conditions on the other. And this slide is summarizing a bit the effects of purchasing practices on wages. Minus 11% wages along the supply chain, you know, when you have prices below cost. Inaccurate technical specifications, you know, minus 12%. This was the average of all the economic studies that we did. Inaccurate order forecast, you know, with very short lead times, minus 12%. And, you know, of course, you know, you may also have a positive effects on number of working hours when you have, you know, very short lead time. So, but this to tell you that the magnitude of the effect on wages is quite high. And there is a discussions about, you know, paying a living wage, you know, among brands. But you can see that, you know, 10% here, 10% there. Clearly there you have a margin, you know, to have suppliers paying a living wage if purchasing practices could be improved in one way or another. And what was really surprising is that the buyers were not contesting that. You know, they were really saying, yes, I mean, we know that our purchasing practices can have a detrimental effect on wages. 75% said that indeed they had some effects on wages, and 12% said that, you know, the impact was of a very high magnitude. And I would like to finish with this, you know, graph on the right side, which I think will resonate with many brands here present in this call, because we asked the buyers, you know, do you believe that your company's purchasing practices influence the payment of a living wage, fair wage, by your suppliers? 67% replied positively. So the awareness is there, but of course, it is important now, I mean, to sort of transform this awareness into action, you know, so that purchasing practices could somehow be reformed, you know, to make sure that first suppliers would be in the optimal condition to pay a living wage, but then, of course, you know, to make sure that there would be sustainability, you know, among global supply chains. So, and this leads me to this last slide, because I think that these type of studies are needed because they highlight some hidden parts of global supply chains. Of course, there have been studies on low wages, excessive overtime hours, and poor working conditions among global supply chains, but not much on the root causes. And the root causes are to be found at the core of global supply chains. And, you know, the root causes are precisely in this relationship between buyers and suppliers in the terms of the contracts. And with generally a sort of unbalanced relationship between the buyers and suppliers. This was confirmed by the buyers. This was proven, you know, by all the econometric analysis we did. On the one hand, I mean, since all these studies that were carried out before the COVID-19 crisis, I can see also in the work I'm doing with the Fairwich network, I can see that many brands started to touch purchasing practices here and there. There were some reforms to improve, for example, technical specifications, or to improve some sort of planning of the orders. But generally speaking, there's not much reforming in two core purchasing areas, which are lead times and pricing. And clearly, if the brands do not touch those two important purchasing practices, this will not place suppliers in the optimal conditions to pay a living wage and to have decent working conditions. And this in the first tier, in the second tier, and even worse in the last tier. So clearly there is a need, for the brands to start addressing, these important areas of purchasing practices, which are lead times and pricing. This certainly requires sort of reforms, some changes in the business model. And this is important not only for suppliers, but it is important for social sustainability of the brands and the global supply chains, as a whole. So, but I'm sure that we'll address these issues with the with the next speakers. But definitely, these are important elements that we should try to put at the core of the agenda in terms of global supply chains and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Just a quick intervention here, just so that you remember the reality of Bangladesh and, of course, Asian suppliers. There is unplanned expansion from the suppliers, which leads to basically low prices. And the lead time, when we do overtime, it does not increase the efficiency of the workers. And what worried me most was your slide on brands saying that it has no correlation, and almost 15% of the brands said there's no correlation between this and good purchasing practices and of course wage. So that worried me. But over to Professor Damian Grimshaw for his comments. Has he joined? Because I can't see him.
Hi, yeah, I'm here. Thanks for that, Rubana.
Hi.
Meet you. Yeah, if I take a few moments. Well, it's a great book, and it's really nice. It's a pleasure to be here to share this launch with Daniel and other colleagues. So, I've known when I was at the ILO that Daniel was working intensively on this survey and analyzing this really original data on what suppliers were saying about the purchasing practices that they had to operate to. And I think Daniel's right to make this claim that it's very original in terms of shedding light on what he calls this hidden feature of global supply chains. I think that's right. But also I think his perspective on things is a really nice contribution to our wider knowledge. Because very often we get tied up with trying to say what the type of global value chain is and what are the characteristics of the buyers. And often we get the literature, at least, gets very focused on the different features of competitiveness and trying to explain how and why this has become a booming aspect of the global economy. But as Daniel says in the book at the beginning, we already know that this is the major driver of the global economy, right? So we know this. What we don't know is why global value chains have not been as big a contributor to aspects of social and economic development as they were intended to. I mean, if you go back 10, 20 years and read the World Bank reports, they were making very strong claims for the contributions of global value chains to economic development. In their more recent one in 2019, where one of their flagship reports focused on global value chains, they were far more circumspect. Not in the preface. The preface to that report was still making those strong claims, but I think that person hadn't read the report. But once you dig into the report, especially actually Rubana, they talk a lot about Bangladesh. And they say in that report that although global value chains can be associated with more productivity and more profits, when you divide up the data between developed countries and developing countries, that relationship only holds true for developed countries. It's absolutely a striking claim. It's in the sort of pages 86, 87, if you want to check it out. And they make that admission in black and white, that these relationships are positive for developed countries and negative for developing countries. And they go on also to say, and I think this is where Daniel's work sheds a lot of light, because the other big question is, how are global value chains contributing to widening income inequalities around the world, both within countries and increasingly between countries? And I think this striking relationship that Daniel's uncovering between the types of sort of outmoded purchasing practices where lead times and pricing are focused to the cost, to the expense of quality and technological know-how, but where they're doing, where they're emphasizing on this is having, as Daniel's shown, adverse consequences for wages. So they can't even keep up with minimum wages and living wages. But the biggest story, of course, is one of inequalities. So inequalities that we're seeing within countries and widening wage gaps between countries are being driven by global value chains. So trade patterns may be benefited by global value chains, but income gaps are widening. And again, the World Bank recognizes this. They're not coming up with the policy proposals to do anything about it, but they do recognize that suppliers in some of the developing countries are having adverse effects on their margins. So their margins are being squeezed by the powerful buyers, but also in their negotiations with workers within the suppliers, they're having to squeeze wages. So you have these very interesting foreign capital, domestic capital effects, and then domestic capital, domestic workforce effects. But of course, one cannot deny that the foreign capital, i.e. the global buyer, is having more or less a direct influence on the working conditions of the domestic workforce, right? So it's a fairly clear link that can be traced. I mean, the ILO struggles a lot with that sort of cross-national policy vision and framework for recommendations, but it has to be tackled because it's so clear. And if the World Bank is worried about it, then other international organizations such as the ILO need to worry too. So I find this very it's very inspiring work. Can I just say a couple of things? Because I didn't receive the books. I've only read those chapters that were available. So, I just had a few questions, maybe for discussion or for Daniel. One was whether I really like the 5 features of purchasing practices. I wonder whether you've done or you're thinking of doing any sort of cluster analysis to find different types of purchasing practices, because that way you might find that some purchasing practices, you might find some bundles which actually are better than others, right? Not that it's a best practice, but some might be simply better than others, and there may be some really worse practices. And it'd be nice to know what sort of percentage of your purchasing practices can be fit into the worst camp. So how bad is the story overall? The other thing is how the different countries look. So the countries of suppliers, again, are there some worrying cases that where policy really needs to be targeted, policy actions need to be targeted. The other thing is the agency of supplier, because the supplier is also an employer with capital investment, with a set of intentions and strategies. They're not only acting under pressure from the buyer. And I think it's important to see that, right? I mean, we learned a lot from the Rana Plaza disaster, but it wasn't only because of pressures from the global buyers, right? Those local suppliers also were not doing their job. You said also that a lot of the suppliers are resorting to subcontracting. Maybe that's not something you can pick up in this work, but I'd like your reflections on what do we know about the subcontracting conditions? Are we going further along the supply chain into the realm of informal work and informal enterprises and perhaps even household work, as we know in the garment sector? Which brings me to my other question, which is about sector effects. So I would presume the higher the labor share of production costs, the worse these effects. So whether you've got something you can say about sectors, that's something I know in your book, the parts I've read. You talk a lot about the different kind of sectors. So if you could maybe just say a couple of things about that. But I'm very struck, just to finish up, about your overall message that you're really saying that the global supply chain model as a major feature of the global economic order is simply not sustainable if it's not even able to keep people's wages above water. So therefore, you're talking about a change of business model, but that's not going to happen without any sort of external pressure. So where should that external pressure come from? The NGOs do a lot of work. Is it about trade unions in developing countries? Is it about a stronger role for the ILO? Or is it about governments in those host countries? I think we've relied on the global buyers to do the right thing for the last 20 years, but that hasn't got us to where we need to be. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. Just another intervention, just to tell you that post-Rana Plaza countries like Bangladesh have learned their lesson. And we've tried remediating, but then again, it's not enough. We need to do more. It's not about structural, electrical, or fire integrity. It's about the general moral compass. On that note, I turn to Ms. Julie Vallat, who's the VP of Human Rights of L'Oréal, for your kind comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Daniel, for this great book. As you mentioned, Daniel, there is some awareness, but I think much more needs to be done to build this awareness even deeper. And having the data you are sharing with us will be very useful, including for the businesses that are already aware and that are working on it and that are trying to make progress. So the more data we have, the better. Even at the end of the book, when you suggest changing some business models, providing, as Professor Grimshaw said, best practices and the examples to build on will be very, very helpful for the sake of interest of everyone. So thank you. So again, we fully share your view, and that's why, as you said very rightly, it's very important to have, for example, a living wage commitment, but obviously it should come along with many other dimensions, as you know, again, in terms of non-discrimination, in terms of gender pay gap, in terms of making sure, as you said, contracts are in place, because informality can lead to very bad practices and no rights for the workers, collective bargaining, obviously. So this is very, very important. And again, it varies a lot from one region to another, and that shouldn't be, because as you said, these suppliers are global, and it's very important to have also a global view. So a centralized, let's say, procurement strategy from the corporate side is very key. Again, as you said, it's very important to provide support, social support to suppliers, because very often they sign contracts, and then, when they sign, by the way, and when they sign, they don't know how to do, let's say. So support is very, very important. So for example, at L'Oréal, we are doing social audits, among other measures, and human rights impact assessment. And when doing the social audits, we are paying, for example, we are taking the costs. And when we find out non-compliance, then the supplier take over and fix and of course is involved in the action plan. But without social support, we will not make it. Again, for our living wage, commitments in the supply chain, as you know, we are doing pilots and providing support to suppliers, because without that, it will not happen. So going beyond the fences of the company on these issues, again, it's critical to provide support. Support, of course, we do, and also joining energy with other companies. For example, we are working a lot with Unilever on living wage, and with platforms where there are trade unions, such as, Business for Inclusive Growth before IG, where you have trade unions involved, you have the OECD involved, and many companies from different sectors working on big wage. So without this partnering approach, it will be very difficult to move the needle. So again, to build more resilience among this supply chain, especially in this time of crisis, because of COVID, because of war, because of inflation, it will be even more critical to work together. As you said, not only the buyers, but also partnering with other key stakeholders to make things happen. So again, solidarity will be key, and viewing this in terms of human rights, I think, will be very, very also important to frame, this picture a little bit differently. Voilà, this was my 2 cents. Very short, but thank you again, Daniel, for this great book that will be very helpful, and we will circulate it widely, internally and externally. By the way, if you can share your slides, I think people will go through more easily than the book.
Yeah, with pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vallat, for your very precious 2 cents. We now turn to Ms. Véronique Rochet. She's the Senior Head of Sustainability at Puma. Thank you.
Thank you, Rubana, and congratulations, Daniel. And I will definitely echo Julie. Those slides are would be very good to have. And I'm sorry I didn't read your book yet, but I will for sure. So from another brand perspective, what we, of course, we also have a social monitoring program for the last 20 years. That has been reviewed on regular basis by Fair Labor Association, that has really an accreditation system where they will really put under scrutiny all the practices of brands that include responsible purchasing practice, because it's not only about asking suppliers to improve working condition, it's also how to mitigate the risk of an impact on workers. In 2019, Puma has developed a responsible purchasing practice, and then where we started to actually train internally our staff, and then COVID came. So which I feel also here, a top-down approach is important, because our CEO really instructed all of our sourcing not to cancel orders. And we have seen really how we wanted to not only safeguard business for the suppliers, but also safeguard workers' employment and workers' income through this process. So we have been really measuring about the order cancellation. We were ensuring that they were not yet under production, and we paid for the material if the suppliers had bought the material. So in 2021, when the crisis passed, we started to train internally on our responsible purchasing practice, and our sustainability team started to engage with our sourcing to discuss about how excessive working hours is linked to responsible purchasing practice, for example, how maybe increase of injury rate in the factory can be linked to responsible purchasing practice, or the risk of a factory to be bankrupt as well. And this was an interesting discussion, because they started to realize how purchasing practices can impact when it comes to working hours. For example, if you made a change at the last minute and don't really agree with the factory when there is no dialogue, increasing or decreasing volume, it was interesting for them to really make that link. It's not that obvious for them. And what we are emphasizing in this training is the importance of dialogue between them and the factory. Changes can always happen, right? We're a business company, but not agreeing or not reviewing the lead time, that then cause a problem. So we really try to emphasize in a dialogue based when there are changes, when they have to create any kind of changes that could impact working condition. And then one more thing on how we are working, and I don't say we are there yet. I mean, we're just trying to create awareness internally and also train suppliers on what we have as a responsible purchasing practice policy, so they also can raise the flag, and getting their input on our purchasing practices is also important, because it's not like people want to create trouble on purpose. They don't realize the link and the consequence, because it's a bit far away from their daily work. So we also engage with better buying to really have a more objective and very not biased feedback from our own purchasing practice. So it's important to keep that dialogue open together with the factories, because again, I think it's not about doing it wrong in purpose. It's not realizing the link of their actions on the working condition. So that's it from my side.
Thank you very much for your comments. It just brings us to a critical period in manufacturing when COVID happened, because what happened was there was so much cancellation, and Daniel refers to Mark Anner's research, report on cancellations. And we had a tough time. So suppliers at times need to insist on transparency from buyers and also from themselves. I think we've had a lovely discussion. Daniel, would you want to add something? Because Jamie's going to take over from now for the question answers, if there are any, Jamie. So before that, maybe Daniel, over to you, your comments.
Yes, with pleasure, Rubana. So many things to add, but maybe a few answers first to Damian, because it's true that he touched a couple of important elements. First about the possible typology, sort of cluster analysis, and in fact, I tried to do it, for example, in the case studies. There are 31 factories. And I tried to identify what type of working conditions issues they had, and also what type of reporting we had in terms of purchasing practices. And this was indeed very useful, because first we could see that there was a profile that was emerging by sectors. For example, it was typical in the garment sector, but also in the fruits sector, for example. That was typical of South Africa. There were 2 factories, and there was lead times were so short. Sometimes 24 hours, and clearly there was a lot of night work, and it led to workers being shouted at by their supervisors. Health and safety issues with a higher number of accidents and so on. So there was this sectorial profile emerging, and at the same time, I was able to identify that certain purchasing practices had specific effects on one type of working conditions. Clearly, lead times lead to higher working hours over time. That was clear. Technical specifications lead indeed, to increased number of sampling. So it increases the cost, for the company in a very, in a great way, and it has an impact which is quite significant on wages. So, and I think it's by identifying this, different, causality effects of specific purchasing practices that we can do something. As Véronique said, sometimes, the director of the design department, they just want to change the style, to 3 buttons to your, to your jacket instead of 2 buttons, it's because it's more fancy and they want to change that. It's understandable from their point of view, but this is putting pressure on the suppliers. And it's true that there must be guidelines, there must be, a certain number of, of policies, which should be strict, I think, if you want to have your supply chain sustainable. Then something you said also on subcontracting, are the conditions worse, more down you go in the supply chain? And the answer is yes, clearly. And this not only in Bangladesh, but you can see that typically in the luxury sector in Italy. We made a study with Camera della Moda in Italy 2 years ago on 45 suppliers in the luxury sector. The first year was pretty okay, but then when you go down the chain, you start, touching, for example, home workers, and clearly there, I mean, they're often in the south of Italy and so on, and, working conditions are much worse. So it is important for the brands when they talk about social sustainability, when they talk about, paying a living wage, to ensure, the first tier of supplier, but also progressively, the other tiers. And then another important question you asked is about, how to change the business model. So, that's a multi-million question, but we need first to start changing the practices. First awareness. As Véronique said, it's important that even the procurement department, the design department, know about the implication of this type of changes in purchasing practices. Then it's important to have all actors involved. You rightly put all the debate within the inequalities debate, and if there is a call today to the brands to pay a living wage, it's precisely because there is these growing inequalities everywhere, and the governments, international organizations know that if the brands move, something can change, because of course, they are, reaching millions of workers. So clearly we need the brands, but we need also governments. Governments like, Germany, the Netherlands, I mean, they're moving in terms of laws, in terms of regulations of supply chains. And then, of course, we need international organizations. And, I see Rachel here, Julie, and so on. They're part of the UN Global Compact. The OECD is doing quite a lot. So clearly there is a need to have a sort of pressure, on the brands, so that they would start, using new types of purchasing practices as a sort of new, business model. And just one word, Rubana, about, Rana Plaza, because you rightly said, the solutions are complex. But I think one thing which was good about the agreements that followed, Rana Plaza's tragedy is that it was an obligatory agreement. And I think that, this is changing also quite a lot. So I think that, we also need to have, binding rules in terms of regulating better global supply chains. Just now, just a few words about Julie's comments about the need to train suppliers. And I think that L'Oréal case is quite exemplary, because we put in place a living wage program, and L'Oréal put in place a pilot, program to ensure that the suppliers would have access to living wage data, would have access, to, how, to pay a living wage. And I think that this helps to demystify, the living wage journey, which is sometimes seen as, too complex, too costly, for the suppliers. Suppliers need to know that it's not only a cost, but it's also an investment. And I think that with this type of pilots, programs, we can really demystify the fact that, the living wage journey would be too complex. And then finally, Véronique, I totally, agree on this need to have clear rules in terms of cancellation of orders. Rubana, you said it, the crisis in Bangladesh was quite, hitting. If I take Hannah's, results, 46% of suppliers in Bangladesh reported most of their orders to have been cancelled. Okay, 6% of all their orders cancelled. And in fact, this, puts 58% of suppliers in a bankruptcy, situation. So clearly there, the fact that, brands started to cancel all their orders without paying raw materials, for example, clearly puts from one day to the other suppliers in an impossible, position. And it's here, that this more equal redistribution of costs and more equal redistribution of profits along global supply chain take all its sense. And I think that we should really work, if we want to have a new business model, or a revised business model within global supply chains, it is important to work on these more equal terms in terms of costs and in terms of profits. Sorry, Rubana, I'll stop here.
Great. Daniel, so that you know, Mark based his research on a portal that the manufacturers opened, just stating cancellation. So you see, it's important to have transparency at every stage, including supplier practices. Suppliers also need to be very, very transparent with subcontracting. And trust me, there may be rules, but there are always loopholes to work around it. So we have to be well-meaning. It's also just not about training us. It's also about self-awareness from the supplier side as well as brands. Over to Jamie. Are there any questions?
Great. First of all, thank you to all of the speakers, and some fascinating conversations there to Daniel, Damian, Julie, and Véronique, and of course yourself, Rubana. For the Q&A session, which is about to begin, as you'll see on the bottom right-hand corner, just to reiterate, there is a chat box. So if there are any questions that come to mind at any time, just put your questions into that chat box, and we'll get to everybody one by one. And if you could also indicate whether you'd be happy to speak directly, or whether you'd prefer for me to ask the questions on your behalf. And if you are going to speak, just please ensure that you activate your microphone. So the first question that we have is Ziad. Ziad, would you like to take the question yourself? Ask the question yourself, rather?
Yes, no problem. Hello, Daniel and everyone. First of all, congratulations again. And so it was well understood what you said about the role of brands and the role of buyers and so on. But what I was also asking, that as we all know, there are different living wage data providers out there, and there are different calculation methods, different theories, and different results in the end in different regions and countries. So do you think there is a role to be played between living wage data providers also maybe to facilitate this process?
Shall I answer immediately, or we take a few questions? Rubana, Jamie, how do you see that?
I think just going one by one, so question and then answer.
Okay. No, Ziad, I mean, and yeah, it would be great, I mean, to, if you can say, where you're from and so, but,
yes,
sorry?
Sorry, you want me to introduce myself?
Yeah. Just, it's,
okay.
I know you are, but, maybe not.
Yes, so I'm Ziad. I'm working for Decathlon, and currently leading the Responsible Compensation Project.
Yes, great. Thanks a lot. Yes, and that was an important question about the data on the living wage. And you're touching something important, because a couple of years ago, there were so many, different data and so on, and it was difficult for the companies to know in the end what data to use on the living wage. And I think that we made quite a lot of progress over the years. We tried, as you know, I'm chairing the Fair Wage Network, and at the Fair Wage Network, we tried to have a systematic series of surveys at local level with local teams, which allowed us now, to have, living wage thresholds in, nearly 200 countries. So we cover them all. And also to have more than 3,000 living wage thresholds at local level, by individual regions and cities. So that, there is a coherent approach in terms of, providing a reliable data set. And at the same time, I can see that there is really efforts at international level, to make sure that there is a coherence, among data providers themselves. And I think that, IDH showed a bit the way by, setting a certain number of, common criteria, which are important in terms of what's, items to be covered in, the family budget and so on and so forth. And they recognized a certain number of, living wage data sets. The Fair Wage Network was part of them. But I think it really, helps to improve, this coherence, within global supply chains. And I think that Now, I mean, I don't hear anymore, brands saying, we don't know what data to choose anymore. They know that there are, a few data providers, the data are reliable, they can work with one or the other, but there are coherent data sets. And then it is important to be coherent also in the criteria, behind the living wage calculation in terms of, the family size you take on board and, the number of. So clearly you need, to have this coherent approach. But I think that we made progress, in terms of measuring, living costs and providing living wages, to companies. And I think that, brands are responding, to the call that I was mentioning before, made by international organizations, governments. I can see an increasing number of brands here in this call that try indeed, to have first the commitments and then to have a methodology, to implement that commitment and to make sure that they will have all workers paid at least a living wage. So I think that I'm quite optimistic there. I think that now we have reliable data much more than in the past. We have a certain coherence at international level, and it will, improve even further. We are working with other data providers, for example, to make sure that, we're working around the same criteria. And I think that now the brands are really putting in place internally a certain number of mechanisms to make sure that they are able to compare, their wage data, to the living wage benchmark. So I think that, that will also help, because there is a recognition that, there is something to be done in terms of the living wage. And another thing that we see is that when the CEO, the top management is behind, the living wage, the fair wage policy, it has an impact also on this internal process of paying a living wage, first to all employees and then to employees of strategic suppliers.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Ziad. Rubana, you raised your hand there whilst Daniel was speaking. Did you have a question?
Yes, a quick one. Daniel, it would be good if you touched upon the open costing a bit, as you've done in your book. I think that wasn't in your slide, but it would be helpful to understand the impact of the suppliers sharing the open costing with their employees. Thanks.
Yes, this is an interesting aspect because it's true that there have been attempts by a certain number of companies, to have more transparent, costing along supply chains. So it's true that many buyers have asked, for example, their suppliers to be more open in terms of, what are the costs that they have, etc., in terms of raw materials, energy, wage cost, and so on, so that, the brands could also incorporate, this information about wage costs also, for planning the payments of a living wage among those suppliers. What we found out, especially, through these surveys, is that the suppliers are not really keen, to have this open costing for a number of reasons, but it's pretty simple. By providing more information about their costs, of course, it's easier for the buyers, to know better, what are their costs and what is their margin. So in a way, it provides also a certain number of information to the buyers that can be used by the buyers to even further negotiate prices. And you could see, with the results of the book, pricing, is a very sensitive area, for the brands and for the suppliers. And you could see that, suppliers are often in a disbalanced bargaining position vis-a-vis the buyers. So it's true that, from the survey results among suppliers, we could see that, suppliers were not really open, to have open costing. And many of them told us, why should we be open about, our cost? Is the buyer open about their cost? You see, what is their margin? We would like to know as well. So you see, it's part of this, this balancing bargaining position of suppliers who sometimes have to accept more and more without, getting elements that would sort of, help them to have a better bargaining position. But I'm sure, Rubana, you also have quite a lot of experience in terms of open costing. So do you have the same, views than me, I mean, from this survey results, or do you see suppliers who are keen in having this open costing?
Daniel, very honestly, suppliers don't want to share open costing. You know why? Because it's a question of also the buyers tracking efficiency in the factories. And if we are more efficient with the style, then the buyer says that since you're efficient, you can offer me a lower cost. So even efficiency has a negative impact. So you see, it's just not about contracts. It's also about a deeper and a longer, more dependable relationship between the supplier and the buyer, which actually yields better results. So even with contracts, if the buyers are quick to evoke the force majeure clauses, in terms when COVID happened, that's exactly what happened. And suppliers are also just left in a mess and in the dark. So it's a question of building more, actually tighter relationships between the brand and the suppliers. And also, Daniel, just to bring one point home, it's about the costing. You kept on referring to lower costs. Higher production costs and lower quotes to the buyers. You know what happens? The buyers often place a lot of pressure on the supplier to expand. And they keep on saying, we need more space, more space, more space. And then the supplier thinks that, okay, my next 5 years are assured, so let me expand. And we expand based on the buyer's request, I'm sure of the future of the apparel consumers. But then what we do is we expand, and then when we don't have enough orders, we undercut each other and take the orders at a lower cost because there are bank liabilities to be paid off. So the buyers also need to diversify their basket. Not all eggs need to be put in the same basket. And while I understand how buyers concentrate and consolidate their supply chain, it's just important for them to have more options. Because that's just safer, that's better. Otherwise, there'll always be a cost crunch, and we will always not be able to offer the best possible wage to the worker. Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting.
Okay, thank you, Rubana. Were there any other questions for Daniel or any of the other speakers? We'll take that as a no then. Okay, so I think we'll bring the meeting to a close at that point then, if there are no further questions. Thank you very much once again for joining us today and taking the time out of your schedule. This has been an excellent session, really fascinating talk, and some erudite questions and answers there. The book will be available at a discount to everybody who has participated in the meeting today, the details of which I'll email to all of you following the end of this session. And we'll also have details for the recording of the meeting and how that can be accessed in probably a few days' time.
Great. Was there no free books for the participants, Jamie? Or
yes, that is another thing I forgot to mention. Free copies will be available to all of the speakers, and I'll get the details of everybody after this. Okay.
Great. Excellent. Thanks a lot, to the speakers, but also to the participants. And let's keep together, working on this, global supply chains and try to, reinvent the business model of global supply chains. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.